Russia and Belarus have launched joint military drills that are being watched nervously by some of their neighbors.
Imagine millions of tons of goods, thousands of trains, hundreds of cities connected in a single transport flow. This is the railway artery that connects East and West, China and Europe. Over the past 10 years, it has become one of the most important routes for global trade, transporting electronics, cars, industrial equipment, and food product. For manufacturers, it is a lifeline that saves them from maritime delays. For buyers, it is a guarantee of stable supplies for entire countries. It is a source of income and political influence. But overnight, this route was blocked. Hundreds of trains were stranded at the border, and billions of dollars worth of cargo was stuck in a dead end.
Reho Astapenia is director of the Belarus Initiative at Chatham House. That's a think tank based in London. He joins us from Warsaw. Welcome to DW. So we have Belarus and Russia.
Why did this happen? And are we really witnessing a new geopolitical game where railways are being turned into weapons? Today we will talk about how Poland, located in the heart of Europe, blocked one of the most important trade routes of the 21st century. How did this decision affect not only China but also the whole of Europe, including Poland itself? What lies behind the official statements about security? And what were the real reasons that prompted Warsaw to take such a drastic step? To understand the scale of what is happening, we need to look at history. Once upon a time, the Great Silk Road connected China with Europe, opening up space for trade and cultural exchange. 2,000 years later, it has been revived in a new format, in the form of an express railway project, which has become a key part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Hundreds of thousands of containers travel thousands of kilometers every year in just 2 to 3 weeks. Every node on this route is important. Germany has become the largest logistics center, but it was Poland that remained the bottleneck, without which the route would have been impossible.
Carrying out these Zapad exercises, and it happens at regular intervals, and it's happened for many years. What do this year's drills tell us about the state of their relationship?
And then, unexpectedly, Poland closed all border crossings with Belarus. The official version is military threats and exercises near the borders. But should we believe this explanation alone? Immediately after the incident, Warsaw requested tens of billions of euros from Brussels to strengthen its defenses. This raises the question: has trade become a bargaining chip in the big game for money and influence? However, China was ready for such a turn of events. Within a few days, Beijing announced the launch of new routes that should reduce dependence on Poland. Southern corridors, Arctic routes, railway projects in Central Asia, all this is part of a long-term strategy where one country will no longer be able to control trade flows on its own. But does this mean the end of Poland's monopoly? Or will Warsaw remain a key player, blackmailing Europe and China with its geographical position?
Well, it's a difficult question. I think that if you compare Belarusian army with the Russian army 4 years ago, it will definitely look like less significant, less important, etc. But considering that Russia has now to recruit almost anyone.
Today's story is not just about railways. It is a story about how transport is becoming a political tool. How decisions made in one office can disrupt supply chains at thousands of factories, leave stores without goods, and farmers without markets. It is a story about how fragile the global world remains, even when everything seems to be running smoothly. And most importantly, it is a story about what lies ahead. Will Europe continue to depend on routes through Poland? Will China be able to build alternatives? And what consequences will this have for each of us? We will tell you all about it right now. Over the past decade, the China-Europe Railway Express has become a symbol of a new world in which global trade is becoming faster and more direct. Where caravans once traveled along the ancient Silk Road, steel trains loaded with containers now rush along the rails, connecting Chinese industrial zones with European metropolises. At the beginning of the project, many were skeptical. It was believed that it would not be able to compete with sea transport, that it was too expensive and vulnerable to politics. But reality proved otherwise. Since 2011, the number of routes has grown almost exponentially, and by 2024, the network will cover 25 countries and more than 200 cities. During this time, trains have transported more than 11 million containers, and the value of cargo has exceeded $450 billion. For comparison, this is comparable to the annual GDP of a moderately developed European country.
And this exercise usually shows us some differences in the relations between Belarus and Russia and the West.
These figures not only demonstrate the potential, but also show that the railway corridor has become a real economic artery. Unlike the sea route through the Suez Canal, where a delay of several days can cause chaos in global markets, rail delivery takes an average of 15 to 20 days. This is twice as fast as ships and almost 3 times cheaper than air transport. These figures became particularly significant during the pandemic, when sea containers were idle for weeks in ports, while the railway continued to operate. For many companies, it was the China-Europe Express that enabled them to survive. Within China, the project has been given strategic status. Departing from Chongqing, Yiwu, Chengdu, and other industrial centers, the trains do not just carry goods, they carry the idea that Beijing is capable of dictating new rules of the game. Each new station in Europe is perceived not only as a logistical victory, but also as a political presence. On the map, it looks like a giant spider web, with China at the center and dozens of European cities connected by threads of railways. Germany occupies a special place in this network. Duisburg has become Europe's largest logistics hub, receiving up to 70 trains from China every day. Electronics, textiles, and household appliances are unloaded here, and industrial goods, including automotive components, chemical materials, and machinery equipment, are shipped back. But if Germany has become the heart of the European reception, then Poland has become its throat, a bottleneck through which the vast majority of routes pass.
So Belarusian army probably looks not so bad. So it definitely has some people, it still has some equipment, which from the Soviet Union as well. So I think that in general, it's not so great, but it's not so bad.
Despite the scaled-back nature of these exercises compared to previous years, some of Belarus's neighbours are worried. Poland, for instance, has closed its border with Belarus. Lithuania has boosted controls. What are they concerned about, and are those concerns well-founded?
Warsaw is in a unique position thanks to its geography. Almost 90% of all trains cross Polish territory, and it is here that the key terminal in Molaskwicz is located, through which up to 98% of containers pass. This is not just an unloading station, but an entire logistics city where thousands of people work. Here, cargo is transferred from broad-gauge railcars to standard European ones. Documents are checked, and customs procedures are carried out. During peak periods, Molaskwicz handles up to 1,000 containers a day, and its total annual capacity exceeds 350,000 units. It is Poland that has been able to reap enormous benefits from the project over the past 10 years. According to experts, the logistics sector associated with Chinese cargo brings the country more than $5 billion annually. But it's not just about money. Hundreds of Polish farmers who previously could not export perishable products to Asia have gained new markets. For example, dairy exports have grown by 78%, and Poland now ships up to 120 million tons of dairy products to China annually. Cheese, butter, and powdered milk, which previously barely made it to neighboring countries in fresh form, now travel thousands of kilometers in a matter of weeks.
Probably we should start from the point that actually it's not the first visit, right? So there were like 4, 5, 6 visits, probably some of them were not public over the last 7 months. That is why we see that this is pretty dynamic relationship between Trump administration and Lukashenko's regime.
However, there is a downside to these impressive figures. Poland has become increasingly dependent on transit. More than 20 large logistics companies literally live off the Chinese Express. In some cities, up to 40% of local jobs are directly linked to this project. During periods of heavy traffic, even small hotels and restaurants thrive thanks to drivers, dispatchers, and technicians. But this also makes the system vulnerable. Any stoppage of trains threatens to deal a blow to the regional economy. Warsaw has realized that its geographical location is becoming a strategic lever. On the one hand, Poland has become China's gateway to Europe. On the other hand, for Europe itself, it is Polish territory that has become a buffer through which key trade flows pass. This has strengthened the country's political significance. Some experts even argue that Brussels is forced to take Warsaw into account much more than before, realizing that the stability of supplies depends on its decisions. But with this growing role came the feeling that Poland could use this position to its advantage. At informal forums in Warsaw, it was often suggested that, as long as there is no alternative, it is Poland that dictates the terms. Examples were given of cases where customs delays were explained as being due to technical reasons but in fact coincided with negotiations on European subsidies. Such coincidences led analysts to say that the railway corridor was becoming part of Poland's domestic and foreign policy.
And Oreshnik is capable of carrying nuclear warheads, I have to remind you. And also we have to remember that Russia has stationed its tactical nuclear weapons on the territory of Belarus in 2023. And last year it actually signed a treaty that guarantees security to Belarus. This includes possible use of nuclear weapons to repel aggression. And last but not least, some analysts say that the aim of this Zapad 2022 military exercise is to show that Russia is strong indeed and the war in Ukraine hasn't weakened it, hence the timing.
However, not everything is so clear-cut. Along with the benefits, risks were also accumulating. Polish officials repeatedly raised the issue of security. As early as 2022, scenarios were discussed in which massive dependence on Chinese transport could lead to strategic vulnerability. Suffice it to recall the crisis in the Suez Canal, when a single-stranded container ship brought global trade to a halt. Warsaw began to wonder, what if not one ship, but an entire line of trains were to be blocked? Meanwhile, China understood that Poland was turning from a partner into a potential pressure point. And although Beijing always emphasized mutual benefit, the need to create bypass routes was increasingly discussed behind the scenes. This was even before Poland closed its borders with Belarus for the first time. One way or another, Poland's role by 2025 had become twofold. On the other, its dependence on Chinese transit made its economy vulnerable. At the same time, Poland itself was increasingly aware that its geography was not just a stroke of luck, but a strategic resource that could be converted into political capital. And it was this duality, dependence and power at the same time, that became the basis for future conflict when Warsaw decided on an unprecedented step, blocking the railway artery on which millions of businesses around the world depended.
An attack of any sort on this country is an attack on Canada as a member of the NATO alliance.
When Poland suddenly announced in September that it was closing all border crossings with Belarus, it came as a bolt from the blue. Within hours, the rail traffic, which included hundreds of trains from China and other Asian countries, was paralyzed. Hundreds of locomotives and thousands of containers were stopped at border stations, where they were guarded by soldiers and customs officers, while billions of dollars worth of goods, already scheduled for delivery to European companies, were frozen inside the carriages. What looked like a temporary measure for the safety of citizens to officials in Warsaw turned out to be a disaster for business. The official reason is well known. Several Russian military drones flew into Polish airspace, and soon Moscow and Minsk announced large-scale exercises near the Polish border, where scenarios involving the use of nuclear weapons were allegedly being rehearsed. But behind these arguments lay a whole complex of reasons. Poland has long balanced the benefits of transit with fears of Russia. Each new military incident increased tensions, and this time the coincidence was too convenient.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
Many analysts believe that the key motive was Warsaw's desire to show Brussels and NATO that it was on the front line of the confrontation and deserved additional funds. At that moment, the Polish government was seeking a huge funding package up to €40 billion to strengthen the defense of the EU's eastern flank. By blocking the railway artery, the country was saying, look how vulnerable the West is if we are not protected. And it worked behind the scenes. The European Commission discussed how Warsaw's demonstrative steps had accelerated the consideration of its application. But that's just the outside story. There was also a less obvious factor related to domestic politics. A few months before the events, the ruling party's ratings in Poland started to drop. People were tired of all the talk about war, inflation was pushing up prices, and the logistics sector, which depends on Chinese transport, was demanding new tax breaks. Closing the border allowed the authorities to change the agenda. Instead of discussions about rising food prices, headlines featured images of soldiers closing border crossings and statements about Warsaw's readiness to protect its citizens. Politics turned the economy into a tool, and thousands of railcars became hostages to this scenario.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
The consequences were not long in coming. According to the European Supply Chain Monitoring Center, in the first few days, deliveries of electronic components to several factories in Germany were disrupted. One of the car manufacturers was forced to suspend assembly for 2 days because it did not receive a shipment of Chinese sensors. In the Czech Republic, delays in the delivery of photomodules for solar panels resulted in fines for contractors. Even Italy felt the impact. Containers with textiles and shoes intended for seasonal collections were stuck in transit, and stores received their goods late. The Polish economy was also hit hard. Logistics companies focused on Chinese transit were idle. In Milosewicz's, dozens of warehouses were empty, and workers were sitting without orders. According to local associations, the Polish sector lost more than $12 million daily on storage and transshipment alone. Local entrepreneurs who until recently had been proud of their role in global trade now openly criticized the government. In small towns near the border, this caused a real social upheaval. Dozens of families were left without income because working at the terminals was their only source of earnings.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
The Polish agricultural sector was hit just as hard. Agricultural products that were being transported by rail to China were stuck in refrigerated trucks. The dairy industry lost millions because some of the shipments simply spoiled. The media reported stories of farmers pouring milk into ditches. These images became a symbol of how politics can destroy business. But the situation was most stressful for the European business community as a whole. It became clear that a single political move could jeopardize tens of billions of euros in trade. Companies began looking for alternative routes, and insurance agencies sharply raised rates for cargo traveling through Poland. Some German logistics firms even began signing new contracts directly with sea carriers, preferring the longer but more predictable route through the Suez Canal. China took this as a signal. Beijing understood that Poland, taking advantage of its geographical position, was turning from a partner into a risk factor. And although official statements were limited to diplomatic phrasing, in reality, ministries and corporations began to review their strategies. Just a week after the crisis, China activated an alternative route through the Caspian Sea, known as the Middle Corridor. Cargo flows were redirected through Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, and from there to Europe via Georgia and Turkey. This did not remove the entire burden, but it did reduce congestion and show that a world without Poland was possible.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
Not everyone in Poland agreed with the authorities' actions. Some politicians openly said that closing the border was shooting ourselves in the foot, but their voices were drowned out by a flood of official statements about security. Moreover, many residents of the country really perceived the situation as part of the struggle for national independence and believed that economic losses were the price to pay for security. However, outside Poland, this move was seen differently, as a demonstration that Warsaw was prepared to use trade routes as leverage. The international consequences turned out to be more serious than Polish officials had anticipated. European business associations began to openly discuss the need to diversify routes and reduce dependence on Poland. Some analysts argued that the crisis would push China to accelerate the construction of a line through Central Asia and invest in southern routes. In other words, Poland's decision not only hit China and Europe, but also undermined its own strategic advantage in the long term.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
The temporary closure of borders turned out to be a lesson for all parties involved. For Europe, it was a realization of the fragility of supply chains. For China, it was a reminder that it cannot rely on a single hub. For Poland, it was an experience that showed that the status of a transit monopoly can be both a blessing and a curse. And although train traffic was restored after a few weeks, trust had been undermined. Businesses rarely forget about risks, and many companies have already begun planning their logistics as if the Polish border could close again tomorrow. Thus, Warsaw's decision turned out to be more than a local measure. It became a symbol of how geopolitics intrudes on the economy and how fragile the global order built on interdependence. And perhaps it was this crisis that became the turning point after which China seriously considered building a world where no country could put billions of dollars of international trade on hold. When the Polish transit hub was blocked, it was a wake-up call for those who still believed in the invincibility of the China-Europe route. But for Beijing, the crisis was more of a catalyst than a disaster. At that moment, plans that had previously only been discussed behind closed doors came to the surface, the creation of alternative corridors that would deprive any single country of the ability to hold trade flows hostage. China began to act as if Warsaw had already lost its monopoly. And each new step was designed to show that the future of logistics no longer depended on a single narrow bottleneck.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
One of the most high-profile areas of focus has been work on the Arctic route. For a long time, it was considered exotic, cold waters, icebreakers, dependence on weather conditions. But now, in the Arctic expanses, China has seen a chance to create a transport line that literally bypasses all of Central and Eastern Europe. In September 2025, the first experimental ship left the port of Ningbo, passing through Qingdao and Shanghai, and then heading straight for the Arctic Ocean. The route proved surprisingly successful. The cargo reached the British port of Felixstowe in just 18 days, which is almost twice as fast as a traditional route through the Suez Canal. By comparison, ships through Suez spend an average of 35 to 40 days. Beijing presented this voyage as proof that the 21st century maritime Silk Road can pass not only through the southern seas, but also through the northern ice.